The morning sun had barely risen above the distant hills when Aisha stepped onto the dusty training ground, the cold barrel of the rifle resting awkwardly in her hands and the weight of 100 mocking eyes pressing on her shoulders. She had always known that this day would come, the day when she would be tested not only for her skill but for her spirit. And yet as she looked around at the crowd of boys and men who had trained here for months longer than she had, their smirks cut deeper than any blade. They did not believe she belonged here. They whispered behind her back that a girl's hands were too soft to grip steel, too fragile to steady against recoil, too weak to tame the precision of a bullet. Their laughter echoed like thunder around her heart, and every word of ridicule became another stone in the wall she would have to climb. But she did not flinch. Her father's face flashed in her memory, his voice steady and calm, reminding her that courage was not the absence of fear but the mastery of it. And though her palms sweated and her knees trembled, she walked toward the line with quiet determination, refusing to let them see the storm raging inside her chest. When the instructor called her name, a wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some chuckled, some scoffed, a few even turned away in exaggerated disinterest as though her attempt was not worth watching. But Aisha could feel all their eyes glued to her back, waiting for her to stumble, waiting for her to fail. She inhaled slowly, letting the air burn her lungs and steady her shaking hands. She remembered the nights when she had trained alone under the pale moonlight, using an old wooden stick her father had carved into the shape of a rifle. Her siblings had teased her for talking to the stick as if it could teach her something, but she had whispered to it anyway, whispering patience, whispering strength, whispering accuracy. And now as she stood with the real weapon heavy in her grasp, it felt like every whispered promise had followed her here, wrapping around her shoulders like invisible armor. She crouched into her stance, pulled the rifle close, and let silence consume the chaos of the crowd. The world narrowed into a single breath, and the target in the distance became the only truth that mattered. The first shot cracked through the air like lightning, and for a heartbeat the training ground froze. The bullet flew with a speed she could barely comprehend, striking dead center on the board. A perfect shot. The silence that followed was louder than the gunfire, a stunned hush that swept through every doubting mouth. Aisha did not smile, did not glance at them. She only reloaded with calm precision, as though this outcome had been written in her blood long before today. The second shot rang out, then the third, each finding the center with unerring accuracy. The rhythm of her breathing became the rhythm of the rifle, steady, balanced, unstoppable. The target board shuddered again and again under her precision, and still she did not let herself celebrate, because this was not about proving them wrong, it was about proving herself right, about honoring every moment of secret practice, every tear she had wiped alone in the dark when her arms ached and her resolve threatened to crumble. 25 times she fired, 25 times the bullet landed exactly where it needed to be, and by the end the board was nothing but a single torn hole of perfection, a silent testament to every ounce of effort she had poured into this dream. The crowd that had once mocked her now stood speechless, their smirks erased, their arrogance broken. Some looked at the ground unable to meet her gaze, others stared with wide eyes as if trying to comprehend how the girl they had laughed at had just silenced them with steel and willpower. Aisha lowered the rifle slowly, her hands steady now, her breath controlled, and though her heart hammered against her chest, it was no longer from fear, it was from the sheer weight of triumph. The instructor approached her with measured steps, his face unreadable, but when he reached her he simply nodded, a small gesture heavy with respect, and that was enough. She did not need applause, did not need validation from those who had doubted her. The silence itself was victory, the silence of men who had no words left to belittle her, the silence of a crowd that had to accept what they had just witnessed. But deep inside, Aisha knew this moment was more than just a contest of shooting. It was a battle against every chain society had tried to wrap around her, every whispered word that told her she should not dream beyond the boundaries drawn for her. It was the battle her mother had fought in her own quiet way when she worked twice as hard to be taken half as seriously. It was the battle her grandmother had faced when education was a forbidden dream. And now with every bullet she had fired, she felt she was carrying not only her own pride but the pride of every woman before her who had been told no and had dared to push back anyway. She felt them with her, in her, a chorus of silent warriors reminding her that strength does not wear a single face, it comes in many forms, and hers just happened to be in the steadiness of her hands and the fire of her will. As she walked away from the line, the rifle still warm in her hands, she caught sight of a young girl standing at the edge of the field, eyes wide, lips parted in awe. The child clutched a small notebook to her chest as if she had been taking notes on every move, and in that child's gaze Aisha saw something more powerful than victory. She saw possibility, the spark of inspiration, the beginning of a new story that would not need to wait for generations to unfold. She smiled gently at the girl. A small smile that carried a promise, and the girl smiled back, clutching her notebook tighter as if she had just witnessed the opening of a door she never knew could exist. And in that simple exchange Aisha realized that her true triumph was not silencing the mockery of the men but awakening the courage of those who watched silently from the sidelines. The world outside the training ground would still be cruel, she knew. There would still be voices waiting to tell her she was not enough, still be challenges that would demand more strength than she thought she possessed. But today she had tasted what it felt like to rise above doubt, and that taste was enough to keep her fighting. She thought of her father again, of his voice telling her stories of warriors who stood alone and yet moved mountains, and she understood now that those stories had not been about strangers, they had been about people like her, people who chose to stand when it would have been easier to sit, people who chose to aim when it would have been easier to surrender. And as she left the ground behind, the sound of silence echoing in her ears, she knew she had begun her own story, one that would ripple beyond this day, beyond this place, into the hearts of many who would come after. The night after her victory hung heavy with silence, the kind of silence that carried the weight of change. Aisha lay on her thin mattress staring at the ceiling, her muscles sore from the strain of holding the rifle for so long yet her heart restless with the fire of accomplishment. Outside her small window the crickets sang and the world seemed to move on as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But inside her everything had shifted, the memory of the crowd's stunned faces replayed in her mind, not for pride but as a reminder that courage had the power to alter the course of destiny. Still she could not ignore the lingering doubts that lingered like shadows, questions that whispered whether today's triumph was only a momentary spark or the beginning of something larger. Her mind spun with possibilities. She thought of competitions she had heard about in faraway cities, national championships where only the best were invited, and a small flame flickered inside her telling her she was capable. But another voice told her the path ahead would be harsher than anything she had faced, that one victory would not silence a world determined to keep her small. She turned on her side, clutched the blanket around her, and whispered to herself that she had already survived their laughter, and if she could survive that, she could survive the storms still to come. The next morning the village buzzed with stories of her perfect shots. News traveled quickly through tea stalls and narrow streets, and though many praised her skill with awe, others dismissed it as luck. Some even claimed the instructor must have rigged the test to give her an advantage, and those words stung sharper than any insult, because they revealed that no matter how flawless her performance had been, some would always refuse to accept it. Yet she did not argue. She had learned that silence could be a weapon too. Instead she returned to the training ground the very next day, long before anyone else arrived, the dew still clinging to the earth and the horizon painted with soft hues of dawn. She trained alone, each shot echoing through the empty field like a declaration of persistence. She pushed herself harder than before, experimenting with longer distances, sharper angles, practicing not just accuracy but endurance, for she knew if she wanted to rise higher she would need more than one day's brilliance. She would need consistency, discipline, resilience, and each drop of sweat that rolled down her skin felt like a seed planted in the soil of her future. Her father noticed the changes in her, how her eyes burned with determination, how her hands no longer trembled when she lifted the rifle. One evening as they sat outside under the stars he placed a gentle hand on her shoulder and told her she reminded him of her late mother, a woman who had carried storms in her soul and still managed to walk with grace. Aisha listened quietly, her heart swelling with both pride and grief, because she had been too young when her mother passed to fully remember her. Yet now she carried her spirit unknowingly. The thought gave her strength, and she vowed silently that she would honor not only her father's sacrifices but also the memory of the woman who had given her life. When her father spoke of competitions beyond the village, Aisha's chest tightened with equal parts excitement and fear. She had never left the small world she knew, but the idea of proving herself on a larger stage lit a spark she could not ignore. She knew the road would not be easy, traveling would cost money they barely had, but when she looked into her father's weathered face and saw his unwavering belief, she realized that sometimes belief itself was the greatest currency of all. In the weeks that followed, she became a figure of both admiration and controversy. The children of the village followed her around wide-eyed, some asking if she would teach them, especially the girls who had never before seen someone break through the invisible walls that surrounded them. Yet among the elders there was a different tone. Some whispered that she was becoming too bold, that she was forgetting her place, that such pursuits were unfit for a girl. Their words reached her ears like poison carried by the wind, but instead of breaking her, they sharpened her resolve. She told herself that if her existence rattled them, then it meant she was shaking the ground beneath old foundations, and perhaps that was necessary. One evening as she cleaned her rifle in the fading light, her younger brother asked timidly if she ever grew tired of fighting against so much doubt. She paused, looked at him with steady eyes, and told him that tiredness was not the enemy. surrender was, and as long as she refused to surrender, every drop of tiredness was worth enduring. The boy nodded quietly, and she saw in him the beginning of a new generation that would not accept limits as easily as the one before. Soon an opportunity arrived like a test from fate. An announcement was made about a regional competition to be held in the nearby city, a gathering of the best shooters from across the district. When Aisha heard the news, her heart skipped a beat. It was exactly the kind of chance she had been waiting for, but reality struck like a hammer when she realized the cost of entry and travel was more than her family could afford. 4 days she wrestled with despair, pacing the small courtyard, biting her lip until it bled, wondering if dreams were always destined to be strangled by circumstance. Her father saw her turmoil, and without a word he walked to the small chest in which he kept his savings, coins collected from years of hard labor, money meant for repairs, for emergencies, for survival. He pressed it into her hands despite her protests and told her that sometimes survival was not just about food and shelter but about keeping the soul alive, and if her dream died, part of him would die too. Tears blurred her vision as she hugged him tightly, realizing once again that love was the silent fuel behind every great leap. The journey to the city was unlike anything she had known. The road stretched endlessly, the noise of traffic overwhelmed her senses, and towering buildings cast shadows that made her feel small. Yet within that smallness she found excitement. The competition grounds were vast, filled with people carrying rifles polished to perfection, competitors wearing uniforms and gear that made her simple clothes look shabby. She felt out of place, like an intruder in a world meant for the privileged. But she clenched her fists and reminded herself that bullets did not care about uniforms, only about the strength of the hands that fired them. She entered the arena, her name called among dozens of others. Some glanced at her dismissively, the same way the boys in her village once had, and that old sting of mockery returned. But instead of shrinking, she straightened her back and let their doubt become the wind beneath her resolve. She stepped to the line, took her stance, and prepared to write another chapter of her story. When the whistle blew, the atmosphere thickened with tension. One by one shots rang across the field, the smell of gunpowder mingling with the heavy air. Aisha gripped her rifle, her heart racing, but she remembered the lessons she had carved into her soul during lonely nights of practice. She slowed her breath, aligned her sight, and let the noise of the world fade away. The first shot burst from her rifle and struck true, a near-perfect center, and though applause was absent, a few heads turned in surprise. She did not waver. She fired again and again, each shot tightening her rhythm, every bullet an answer to the silent question of whether she belonged here. By the end of her round her score stood among the highest, and the murmurs in the crowd grew louder. She had once again silenced doubt, not with arguments but with precision, and though she did not win first place, she placed high enough to command respect. For a village girl with no equipment and no formal coaching, it was a victory far greater than any medal could represent. That night, as she sat on the edge of her bed in the small city hostel, she replayed the day in her mind, every cheer, every glance of disbelief, every bead of sweat that had dripped down her back, and she realized she was no longer just a girl with a rifle. She was a story unfolding, a story that carried the weight of her village, her family, and the silent prayers of those who wished for change. She did not know what the future held, but she knew she would keep walking this path, one step, one shot, one victory at a time, and somewhere deep inside she sensed that this was only the beginning of something far larger than herself. The return to her village after the competition was unlike anything Aisha had expected. Children ran alongside the bus as it rolled in, their voices high with excitement, and when she stepped down holding her worn rifle case, a crowd had already gathered. Some clapped, some whispered, some simply stared, but no one could ignore her anymore. The girl they had once mocked had returned as a competitor who had stood shoulder to shoulder with the best of the region. Her father walked proudly by her side, his eyes moist but his posture tall, and though her ranking had not been first place, it felt as though she had carried back a victory greater than gold. She had brought proof that dreams were not locked behind gates of wealth or privilege, proof that even from a dusty corner of the world a voice could rise loud enough to be heard. Yet in the midst of the cheers there were still mutters of disapproval, voices that claimed she had gone too far, that she was drawing attention the village did not need, that a girl stepping into arenas of men would only bring shame. But Aisha had learned how to let those words slip off her skin. They could no longer pierce her. She had stood in arenas far beyond their understanding and found her place there, and that was enough. Her days once again became a rhythm of training and chores, dawn breaking over the fields while she practiced her stance, dusk settling as she returned from long hours of work in the household, and though her body grew weary, her spirit found strength in each repetition. Her younger siblings now watched her with admiration instead of teasing, sometimes handing her water during practice or mimicking her stance with sticks. and that simple sight filled her with a warmth deeper than any trophy could provide. She realized she was no longer training only for herself but for the eyes that looked up to her, the little girl who had smiled at her during her first triumph, the boys who asked her to teach them, the countless unseen souls who might one day find courage in her story. It gave her a new kind of responsibility, a weight she carried not as a burden but as a blessing, for she knew she had been given something rare, a chance to shape the world around her by the choices she made. But as the weeks passed, challenges rose like thorns on her path. The rifle she carried was old, its barrel worn, its scope unreliable, and every shot demanded not just skill but correction for flaws in the weapon itself. In the competition she had noticed how others carried gleaming rifles, modern and precise, and for a moment envy had stabbed at her, but she had quickly turned it into motivation, telling herself that if she could master an imperfect weapon, then one day with proper tools she would soar. Yet the reality of resources weighed heavy. Her father's savings were drained, her village offered no sponsors, and though whispers of her talent spread, few dared to invest in a girl's dream. Some suggested she abandon shooting altogether and focus on something more practical, perhaps teaching or sewing, something acceptable, something safe. But when she closed her eyes and imagined a life without the rifle, it felt like imagining a sky without stars, empty and suffocating. So she refused. She trained harder, determined to make every flaw in her weapon an opportunity to sharpen her instinct, and every time she hit the mark despite the rifle's faults, her confidence deepened like roots anchoring her spirit. One evening as she practiced alone, a stranger appeared at the edge of the field, an older man with sharp eyes and a presence that commanded attention. He introduced himself as a retired marksman who had once competed at the national level, now wandering villages in search of talent worth nurturing. He had heard rumors of the girl who silenced crowds with perfect shots and had come to see for himself. Aisha's heart raced as she realized fate might have sent her an ally. She demonstrated her skill without hesitation, each shot ringing with focus, and the man watched silently, nodding occasionally. When she finished, he approached her with a rare smile and told her she had raw potential unlike anything he had seen in years. But potential needed guidance, discipline, and opportunity. He offered to coach her if she was willing to dedicate herself fully. His condition was simple yet demanding. She would have to push beyond what she thought possible, training not only her accuracy but her stamina, her patience, her mental resilience. And though the path ahead sounded grueling, she agreed without hesitation, because she knew such chances came once in a lifetime. Training under him was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Mornings began before sunrise with long runs to build endurance, afternoons filled with breathing exercises to steady her nerves, evenings consumed by hours of precision drills. He pushed her to her limits, sometimes leaving her so exhausted she could barely stand, yet within the exhaustion she discovered new layers of strength. He taught her to read the wind, to calculate distance by instinct, to treat the rifle not as a weapon, but as an extension of her body, and slowly she began to see changes. Her aim grew sharper, her recovery quicker, her focus unshakable even in chaos. Sometimes she stumbled, sometimes frustration brought her to tears, but the old man never allowed her to wallow, reminding her that champions are not made by easy victories but by rising from failures. And each time she picked herself back up, her spirit became more unbreakable, her determination more radiant. The next competition approached sooner than expected, this time at the state level, a stage grander and fiercer than before. Her coach believed she was ready, though she doubted herself. The scale intimidated her, hundreds of competitors, thousands of eyes. Yet as the day drew closer she remembered the silence of her first triumph, the way the world had seemed to pause as her bullet struck true, and she told herself she could create that silence again. Her father once more gave what little he could for her journey, his hands rough with labor as he pressed coins into hers, and she embraced him knowing every sacrifice he made was another thread tying her to victory. When she arrived at the competition grounds, her breath caught. The arena was vast, banners fluttering, crowds roaring, rifles gleaming like silver under the lights, and for a moment she felt swallowed by the immensity. But then she touched her chest where her heartbeat pounded steady and reminded herself that courage was not the absence of fear, it was stepping forward despite it. When her name was called, the noise of the crowd dimmed in her ears. She walked to her station with steady steps, the rifle in her hands familiar yet heavy with responsibility. She set her stance, aligned her scope, and inhaled deeply. Around her the best of the state raised their rifles, the air thick with tension. The signal fired, and the sound of gunshots erupted like thunder. But within that storm she found calm. Her first shot cracked and struck near the center, the second tightened the pattern, the third landed perfectly, and with each shot she felt herself entering a rhythm where time no longer mattered, where only The bond between her and the rifle existed. Her score climbed, and murmurs rippled through the stands, spectators turning to one another in surprise. The girl who had arrived in plain clothes, with a rifle far older than the rest, was matching and even surpassing many of the polished professionals. By the end of her round she had secured a position among the top finalists, and the applause that rose was no longer hesitant but genuine. Her name echoed across the arena, and she felt tears sting her eyes, not from weakness but from the overwhelming realization that she belonged here, truly belonged. That night as she sat beneath the stars outside the hostel, exhaustion settling into her bones, she thought of how far she had come from the dusty field of her village, how each drop of sweat, each insult, each sacrifice had carved a path that led her here, and she knew the journey was far from over. There would be greater arenas, tougher rivals, harsher storms, but she also knew she carried something inside her that no obstacle could crush. The spirit of a girl who had once been mocked for gripping a rifle and had turned that mockery into music of silence, the spirit of a daughter who carried her father's hopes and her mother's memory, the spirit of a fighter who had learned that every bullet was not just a shot but a statement. And with that thought, she closed her eyes and whispered to herself that tomorrow she would rise again, ready to write the next chapter with courage as her pen and resilience as her ink. The journey toward the next stage of Aisha's life began almost immediately after the state competition ended, because while she had stood proudly among the finalists and earned the respect of strangers who had once looked at her with doubt, she knew deep inside that this was only a stepping stone. The road ahead stretched further than her eyes could see, and the weight of expectations pressed on her shoulders heavier than ever. The people in her village now spoke her name with admiration instead of ridicule. Children followed her steps like shadows. Young girls whispered about becoming like her one day, and though their admiration filled her with warmth, it also carved responsibility into her heart. She was no longer simply chasing her own dream, she was carrying the fragile dreams of many who had no voice, and she vowed silently that she would not let those dreams shatter, even if it meant sacrificing comfort, rest, or ease. So when her coach spoke of preparing for the national qualifiers, she did not hesitate, though the thought terrified her. She agreed, knowing that to stop now would mean betraying the very fire that had carried her this far. Her days grew longer, her training harsher. Mornings began before the first hint of dawn and often ended long after the stars lit the sky. She pushed her body past the point of exhaustion, lifting weights to strengthen her arms, running miles to sharpen her endurance, holding her breath underwater for long stretches to train her control. And each time she thought she had reached her limit, her coach reminded her that champions are forged not at the edge of comfort but in the furnace of persistence. Sometimes she collapsed onto the ground drenched in sweat, tears of fatigue slipping down her cheeks. But each time she forced herself to rise, because in her mind she saw the faces of those who once mocked her. She saw the face of the little girl with the notebook, she saw her father's calloused hands giving her the last of his savings, and she knew surrender was not an option. Failure might come but surrender never would, and so she carried on, step by step, bullet by bullet, turning her pain into strength and her fear into fire. Yet alongside her growing skill, the shadows of doubt never completely vanished. In quiet moments she questioned herself, wondered if she was reaching too far, wondered if fate would eventually remind her of the walls that surrounded her gender, her class, her background, and during those nights she would sit under the sky, staring at the indifferent stars, wrestling with her insecurities until dawn painted the horizon with light. But each time she rose with the sun she felt reborn, determined anew to prove that destiny was not fixed, that it could be rewritten with enough courage. Her coach noticed the storm in her eyes but said little, only reminding her that even the greatest shooters had faced the same demons, that doubt was the twin of ambition, inseparable, and that true strength came not from eliminating it but from walking beside it without letting it lead. His words sank deep into her, and she began to see her doubt not as an enemy but as a shadow that made her light burn brighter. The announcement of her acceptance into the national qualifiers spread like wildfire through her village, and once again a bus was arranged for her journey. This time the crowd that gathered to send her off was larger, their cheers filling her ears as the bus rumbled away. Her father stood silently at the back, eyes glistening, pride and fear mingled in his expression, and though he said little, the tightness of his embrace before she left told her everything. The journey to the city hosting the qualifiers was long and grueling, the arena far larger and more intimidating than the state competition. Banners of sponsors fluttered everywhere, cameras flashed, and competitors arrived from every corner of the country, dressed in uniforms that spoke of wealth and professional training, their rifles gleaming like polished jewels. And for a moment she felt the sting of smallness, her old rifle heavy in her hands, her clothes plain, her shoes worn, but then she reminded herself that bullets cared nothing for glitter, They only obeyed the discipline of the shooter, and she inhaled deeply, whispering silently to her mother's memory that she would not let fear undo what she had built. The day of the qualifiers dawned with thunder in the air, rain having washed the grounds in the early hours, the arena filled with spectators and officials, the hum of voices thick with anticipation. As competitors lined up one after another, Aisha stood among them, her heart racing yet steady. When her name was called, she stepped forward with quiet resolve, gripping her rifle with the same hands that had once been ridiculed. The signal fired, and she let her training take over, her breathing. Even her eyes locked on the target, her body moving with practiced precision. The first shot struck true, not perfect but strong, the second tightened her pattern, the third landed near the bullseye, and as the round continued she found herself entering that sacred rhythm where the world fell away, where only she and the target existed, each bullet carrying not just her focus but the weight of her father's sacrifices, her coach's faith, her village's hope, and with every mark she hit, murmurs rippled through the crowd, disbelief turning into admiration, doubt transforming into respect. By the time she finished her round, her score had secured her a place among the top competitors. Moving on to the next stage, applause filled the air, louder than she had ever received before, and for the first time she allowed herself a small smile, not of arrogance but of gratitude, gratitude that every step of struggle had led her here, gratitude that she had refused to listen to the voices that told her to stop, gratitude that her father's belief had never wavered. She looked up at the stands and caught sight of a few young girls waving, their faces glowing with pride, and she felt her chest tighten, realizing again that she was no longer just one person competing, she was becoming a symbol, and symbols carried a weight that did not end with a single victory. It was a weight that demanded consistency, resilience, and integrity, and though it frightened her, she accepted it with the same calm she used to steady her aim. But victory was not without its price. The weeks of preparation had left her body aching, her hands raw from constant practice, her rifle nearing the end of its life and resources growing scarcer. Her father struggled silently to support her, refusing to let her see the depth of his sacrifices, yet she sensed it in the way his back bent lower each day, in the lines of exhaustion etched deeper into his face. She carried guilt for the burden she placed on him, yet she also knew he would never forgive her if she gave up now, because he did not see her dream as a burden but as an extension of his own, the chance to give his daughter a life beyond the limits he had endured. And so she pressed on, her determination burning brighter than the obstacles, her spirit refusing to bow to the weight of struggle. She told herself again and again that nothing worth achieving was ever meant to be easy, and with each repetition she turned pain into perseverance. As the qualifiers advanced, the competition grew fiercer. Every round tested her skill, her nerves, her endurance. She stumbled at times, her shots sometimes swaying under the pressure of the crowd, but each time she steadied herself, remembering the silence she had created back in her village, remembering that silence was not given, it was earned through courage. She clawed her way through each stage, earning her place among the best, and when the final announcement came, declaring her among those selected to compete at the national championship, her knees nearly buckled, tears welled in her eyes, and she looked toward the sky, whispering a prayer of thanks, for she knew this was the moment she had dreamed of, the moment that once felt impossible, the moment when the girl who had been mocked for holding a rifle had risen to stand among the nation's finest. And though the journey ahead would be harder still, she was ready, because she had learned that the heart of a fighter beats strongest not when the world believes in them but when they believe in themselves. The news of Aisha's selection for the national championship spread faster than wildfire, and this time the whispers in her village carried more awe than doubt. Children shouted her name in the narrow lanes, women spoke of her with admiration, and even those who once dismissed her as a foolish girl with a rifle now found themselves bowing to the truth of her achievements. Yet with recognition came new burdens. The pressure of expectation loomed heavier than ever. Her coach reminded her that the national stage was not a place for hesitation. It was where the strongest of the strong competed, men and women who had trained under the best facilities with access to the finest weapons and coaches. And against them she would seem like nothing more than a fragile flame in a storm, but instead of shrinking from the thought, she clung to it, because she had always been the outsider, always been the one underestimated, and she knew her greatest weapon was not the rifle in her hands but the resilience in her spirit. She told herself that the same silence she had created on the dusty village ground she could create on the grandest stage, if only she trusted the fire inside her. Her father, though bursting with pride, worried silently about how they would afford the expenses of travel, accommodation, and proper gear, but once again he refused to let despair chain them. He sold a piece of land, a sacrifice that cut deep into his future security, yet he did it without hesitation, pressing the money into her hands with the same unwavering belief he had always carried. Aisha's eyes burned with tears as she accepted it, her heart heavy with guilt yet filled with determination to make it worthwhile. She promised herself that every drop of sweat, every bullet fired, every sleepless night would be her way of honoring the sacrifices he made, and so she plunged into preparation, pushing her body harder than ever before, training until her muscles screamed and her lungs begged for relief, but she ignored the pain, because she knew pain was temporary while legacy was eternal. When the day of departure finally arrived, the village gathered in numbers larger than ever before, their cheers following her as she climbed onto the bus, her rifle case strapped tightly to her shoulder, her coach by her side, and her father standing tall though his eyes glistened. She waved to them, the sight blurring as tears filled her vision, yet within that blur she saw hope, love and faith all interwoven. The journey to the national arena was long, the city grander than anything she had seen before. Skyscrapers clawed at the sky, lights blazed brighter than stars, and the stadium where the championship would be held seemed like a world of its own, with thousands of seats, giant screens, and a roar of energy that vibrated in her bones. She felt small in its shadow, but she reminded herself that even the smallest flame can be seen in the darkest night, and she clutched her rifle tighter, whispering that she would not let fear drown her voice. The opening ceremony was a spectacle beyond her imagination, flags waving, anthems echoing, competitors marching in uniforms that gleamed with sponsorship logos, while she walked in plain clothes, her old rifle tucked under her arm. Some spectators glanced at her with curiosity, some with pity, others with doubt, and though those looks stung, she remembered how many times she had faced them before. She remembered that her journey had never been about appearing strong but about being strong when no one believed she could. When her name was announced, a ripple of murmurs ran through the crowd, a girl from a nameless village standing among the best in the nation. But she walked steadily, each step carrying the weight of her history, her sacrifices, her dreams, and as she took her place she felt the roar of the stadium fade into silence in her ears, the same silence she had always found before a shot, the silence where the world narrowed to just her and the target. The first round tested accuracy under time pressure, competitors firing in rapid succession, the arena alive with the crack of rifles. Aisha felt the weight of every eye on her, but she did not rush. She had learned that haste was the enemy of precision. She inhaled, exhaled, fired. Her first shot struck close to the center, her second tightened, her third landed perfect, and as she continued the rhythm returned, her breathing sinking with the trigger, her focus absolute. By the end of her round she stood among the top scorers, and though applause erupted she kept her expression calm, not letting victory distract her. Her coach nodded in approval, pride shining in his eyes, and she felt a surge of strength, knowing she had proven once again that she belonged. As the rounds advanced, the challenges grew tougher, moving targets, longer distances, harsher conditions designed to push competitors beyond comfort. Many faltered under the pressure, their scores slipping, but Aisha found herself thriving, because she had been trained in struggle. Her entire life had been a preparation for enduring hardship. When the wind shifted suddenly and knocked others off course, she remembered her coach's lessons about reading the invisible currents. When the timer ticked down and nerves rattled the strongest, she remembered the calm she had forged in lonely nights of practice, and slowly she rose, step by step, climbing higher in the ranks, her name appearing on leaderboards alongside the most celebrated shooters of the nation. And each time the crowd saw her score, their disbelief turned into admiration, their murmurs into cheers, and she realized she was no longer just competing, she was rewriting what they thought possible. But victory came with its own shadows. The exhaustion gnawed at her body, her shoulders ached from the recoil, her hands blistered, her eyes burned from hours of focus. Yet she refused to stop. Her father's sacrifice whispered in her veins, her mother's memory burned in her heart. The faces of young girls watching from the stands reminded her why she fought, and each time fatigue threatened to break her, she clenched her jaw and pressed forward, telling herself that champions are not those who never feel pain but those who rise despite it. Her coach often found her practicing even after others had retired for the night, sweat soaking her clothes, determination etched into her every breath, and though he scolded her to rest, he knew deep down that her fire was not something that could be contained, it was the very essence of what made her extraordinary. When the final round arrived, the stadium was electric with anticipation. The best of the best stood ready, each one a master in their own right. The targets were set at extreme distances, the wind unpredictable, the pressure immense. Aisha closed her eyes for a moment, shutting out the noise, shutting out the doubts. She pictured her village, the dusty field where it had all begun, the laughter that once mocked her, the silence she had created, and she let that memory fill her with strength. The whistle blew, she raised her rifle, steadied her breath and fired. The first shot hit near perfect, the crowd gasped. She fired again, adjusting for the wind. The second struck closer, she fired once more, and the third landed dead center. The arena erupted in thunderous applause, and though she had more shots to fire, she no longer felt like she was proving anything. She felt like she was simply speaking the language she had always known, the language of focus, courage and resilience. Each bullet another word in the story she was writing across the sky. By the end of the championship her name stood high on the board, not at the very top but close enough to make history, close enough to silence every doubt, close enough to awaken thousands of hearts. When the announcer declared her position, the stadium roared, and she felt tears spill freely. Her coach clasped her shoulder, her father's proud face flashed in her memory, and she realized this was more than victory, it was a promise fulfilled, a journey honored, a dream turned real. And as she stood under the bright lights, applause crashing around her, she whispered silently to herself that this was not the end but only the beginning, because now she had not only proven herself but also carved a path for countless others to follow, and she vowed that she would continue, step after step, shot after shot, carrying the weight of hope in her hands, until the world itself could no longer deny the power of a girl who once dared to grip a rifle. The days after the national championship felt like walking in a dream, because everywhere Aisha when she carried the echo of the crowd's applause in her ears, people who had never known her name now recognized her as the village girl who had risen against the odds. Her story appeared in local newspapers, photographs of her standing with her rifle spread across social media, and though the fame was still small compared to champions who had trained for years, for her it was overwhelming. Back in her village she found herself no longer invisible. Neighbors greeted her with respect, children ran behind her as though she were a hero from their stories, and her father, though too humble to boast, carried a new light in his eyes, the kind of pride that words could never fully capture. Yet with all the admiration came new expectations, whispers of her becoming a future champion, hopes that she would bring glory not only to her village but to her entire state. And though those hopes weighed heavily, she embraced them because she knew she was no longer walking this path for herself alone, she was walking it for everyone who believed, for everyone who dared to dream through her. But success brought new challenges that tested her spirit in ways she had never imagined. Her old rifle, battered and worn, had carried her this far but was now on the brink of collapse, its barrel strained, its scope unreliable, and she knew that if she wanted to continue competing at the highest level she needed a professional weapon. Yet the cost was far beyond her reach. Her father had already sacrificed too much, selling land, giving up savings, and she could not bear to ask more of him. Her coach reached out to contacts, wrote letters to organizations, pleaded with local officials, but support came slowly. Some promised and never delivered, others dismissed her story as a temporary flame that would soon fade, and each rejection cut into her hope like a blade. Still she refused to break. She continued training with the same rifle, treating its flaws as extra obstacles meant to sharpen her skill, telling herself that if she could win with this, she could win with anything. Her coach watched her with both frustration and admiration, frustrated that the world refused to provide her the tools she deserved, admiring that she refused to let the lack of tools define her destiny. During this time she also learned that fame was not always kind, because while many celebrated her, others grew jealous. Competitors whispered that she was only a sensation because of her gender, critics claimed her story mattered more than her skill, and some even accused her of being a symbol created by the media rather than a true athlete. Those words cut deeper than the old insults of her village because now they came from people who understood the sport, people who should have known better. Yet instead of arguing she chose silence once again, letting her bullets speak for her. Every time she stepped onto the training ground she imagined those voices in the wind and fired through them, proving to herself that she needed no one's permission to exist, no one's validation to be worthy, because her worth was written in the steady beat of her heart and the unshakable line of her aim. The more they doubted, the more determined she became, her silence becoming sharper than their words. Amidst the noise of doubt and support, an invitation arrived like a gift from destiny. She was selected to join a training camp for potential international candidates, a place where the best young shooters from across the country would be trained by national-level coaches. The news stunned her, her hands trembling as she read the letter, because this was more than a chance to train, it was a doorway to the world stage. Her father hugged her tightly, his rough hands trembling with emotion. Her coach's eyes softened with rare tears, and the villagers once again gathered to celebrate, this time their cheers louder, their pride deeper, as if her victory was theirs too. Aisha felt her heart swell with both excitement and fear, because the camp would be filled with people far better equipped, far more experienced, yet she reminded herself she had always been the underdog, always been the one underestimated. And she had never once let that stop her. The camp was unlike anything she had ever seen, sprawling grounds with shooting ranges more advanced than she thought possible, equipment shining under the sun, athletes dressed in matching gear, moving with confidence and precision. She felt small at first, her simple clothes and old rifle drawing curious glances. But when the training began she found her place, because the rifle in her hands may have been old, but the discipline in her soul was timeless. Day after day she poured herself into the drills, studying every lesson, listening to every correction, pushing herself harder than anyone else. Her hands blistered, her muscles screamed, yet she never complained. While others rested, she practiced. While others joked, she studied, and soon the whispers about her shifted. Some mocking turned into respect, some curiosity into admiration, as they saw that the girl from the village did not come here to make up numbers. She came to fight, she came to stay. Her performance at the camp began to catch the attention of national coaches, who noted not only her accuracy but her resilience, her ability to adapt quickly, her refusal to bow under pressure. And one day after a particularly grueling session, a senior coach approached her, asking about her story, about how she had learned to shoot, and when she spoke of her father's sacrifices, of practicing with a wooden stick under the moonlight, of silencing a mocking crowd with 25 perfect shots, the coach's eyes softened with something like awe. He told her that champions were not made only of skill but of stories, because stories carried power, and hers had the kind of power that could move nations. His words burned into her, fueling her fire, and she realized that she was no longer simply living her own journey, she was becoming a symbol of possibility for others, and that symbol carried with it both burden and blessing. As the camp progressed, selections were made for international qualifiers, and when her name was announced among those chosen, her knees nearly gave way. She clutched her rifle tighter, tears flooding her eyes, and for a moment she saw her entire journey flash before her. The dusty field of her village, the laughter of the boys who mocked her, the silence of the crowd after her perfect shots, the long nights of practice with aching arms, the sacrifices of her father, the stern but guiding voice of her coach, the roar of the national arena, and now this, standing at the edge of a dream she had never dared to imagine so soon. The thought of representing her country filled her with both pride and fear, but above all it filled her with purpose, because now she was no longer fighting only for herself or her village, she was fighting for her nation, for every little girl who dreamed, for every soul who believed. That night she lay in her bunk staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep, her mind buzzing with possibilities, the weight of responsibility pressing down yet lifting her higher. She thought of her mother, the woman she barely remembered, and whispered into the darkness that she hoped she was making her proud. She thought of her father, working tirelessly back home, and promised herself she would repay him not with money but with glory. She thought of the children of her village, their eyes shining with hope, and vowed she would never let them down. And as she drifted finally into sleep, a single thought echoed through her heart, steady and strong, that no matter what storms awaited, she would face them with the same hands that had once been mocked, the same hands that had now carried her to the edge of the world stage, hands that would one day raise her country's flag high, steady, unshakable, and proud. The days leading to the international qualifiers were filled with a mixture of hope and fear that twined together like fire and smoke in Aisha's chest. She woke before dawn each morning, stretching her tired muscles, whispering prayers into the still air, and then stepping onto the range with the same determination that had carried her from the dusty field of her village to the shining camp of champions. Every shot she fired was not just practice but a promise to herself, to her father, to her nation, that she would not let this opportunity slip away. Yet beneath her resolve lay a current of nerves stronger than anything she had ever faced, because this was no longer just about silencing a mocking crowd or winning a medal for her state. This was about standing on a stage where the world itself was watching, where her flag would fly and her name would be carried beyond borders, and that thought both terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. Her father called her whenever he could, his voice carrying both encouragement and quiet worry. He always asked if she was eating enough, resting enough, and though she reassured him, the truth was that rest rarely visited her, her mind too consumed with visions of the upcoming trials. Her coach noticed the fatigue in her eyes, the tension in her shoulders, and reminded her that strength was not only about pushing forward but also about knowing when to breathe. But Aisha struggled to slow herself down because every second felt precious, every shot a step closer or further from her dream. She often trained alone in the evenings when others had left, her silhouette framed by the setting sun, her hands blistered yet unyielding, and though loneliness crept into those hours, she found comfort in the rhythm of the shots, the echo of the bullets sounding like the heartbeat of her destiny, steady, relentless, and true. When the qualifiers began, the arena buzzed with energy unlike anything she had ever experienced. Banners waving, cameras flashing, athletes from across the country standing tall in pristine uniforms, many armed with rifles that gleamed with modern precision. She felt her old weapon heavy in her hands, scarred and weathered like her own journey, yet instead of shame she felt pride, because this rifle had been her companion through every storm. It had carried her tears, her victories, her pain, and her growth, and as she stepped into her position she whispered a silent vow to it, that together they would carve one more chapter. The whistle blew, and in an instant the world narrowed to target, breath, trigger, shot. The first bullet soared and landed near perfect. A ripple of reaction ran through the crowd. She fired again, adjusting for the subtle wind, another near-perfect strike, and soon she found herself lost in the rhythm, her nerves burning away, replaced by the same calm she had always found in the silence before a shot. By the time her round ended, her score had placed her among the top contenders, and though applause filled the air, she did not smile, not yet, because she knew this was only the beginning. The rounds grew harsher, pushing them through varied conditions, rapid fire, long range, moving targets, each challenge demanding not only skill but adaptability. Some of the most celebrated athletes faltered, their confidence shaken under pressure, but Aisha thrived in the chaos, because she had always been shaped by struggle. When the wind shifted sharply, she remembered the fields of her village, where wind was a constant opponent. When exhaustion pressed against her bones, she remembered the nights of endless practice. When doubt threatened to creep in, she remembered the silence of the crowd she had once conquered, and each memory fueled her resolve, driving her further. Her coach watched from the sidelines with quiet pride, his stern face betraying only a flicker of emotion as her scores climbed higher and higher, and soon whispers filled the stands, whispers that the girl with the old rifle might just be one of the brightest new hopes for the country. Yet the closer she came to victory, the more the weight of expectation pressed down on her. She could feel it in every breath, every glance from the crowd, every moment her name flashed on the leaderboard. And one evening, alone in her dormitory, the pressure finally cracked her composure. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered to herself that she was afraid of failing, afraid of disappointing her father, her coach, her village, her entire country. But as the tears fell, she also remembered something her father once told her, that courage was not the absence of fear but the decision to act despite it. She wiped her face, stood in front of the mirror, and stared into her own eyes, telling herself aloud that she was not just a girl with a rifle, she was a fighter forged in silence, and no amount of fear could erase the strength of her journey. The next morning she returned to the range with new clarity, her heart lighter, her aim sharper, her spirit unshakable. The final day of the qualifiers arrived, the atmosphere electric, the stands packed with spectators and officials, every competitor tense, knowing that only a handful would earn the chance to represent the nation. Aisha's name was called, and as she stepped forward she could feel thousands of eyes piercing into her. But instead of shrinking, she stood taller, lifting her rifle with steady hands. The whistle blew and she began, her first shot slicing through the silence and striking true. Applause followed, but she did not hear it. Her mind was deep in the rhythm. Inhale, exhale, squeeze, fire, again and again, each bullet carrying her determination, her dreams, her sacrifices. When the final shot left her barrel, she lowered the rifle slowly, her chest rising and falling with controlled breaths, and then she looked up at the scoreboard, her name glowing among the top ranks, a place secure enough to guarantee her selection. The crowd erupted, her coach allowed himself a rare smile, and Aisha felt tears sting her eyes. This was the moment she had been chasing, the doorway opening wider than ever before, and she had stepped through it with her own strength. When the announcement came officially that she was among those chosen to represent her country at the international championship, her world tilted, the applause seemed distant, the cheers like echoes from far away. All she could feel was her heart pounding in her chest, her father's face flashing in her memory, his calloused hands, his unwavering belief, her mother's faint smile from old photographs, her coach's stern but guiding presence, the children of her village waving wooden sticks like rifles, and she realized that this victory belonged not just to her but to all of them. Every tear, every sacrifice, every moment of faith had carried her here, and now she was no longer just Aisha from a forgotten village. She was Aisha who would carry her flag onto the world stage, her rifle steady, her eyes unshaken, her spirit ablaze, ready to prove not only her skill but the power of a dream that refused to die. That night the camp erupted in celebration, teammates congratulating her, coaches praising her, reporters asking for interviews. But amidst the noise she found a quiet corner, holding her rifle close, staring at the sky. The stars scattered like targets across the darkness, and she whispered a promise to herself, that she would not let this opportunity slip. She would fight harder than ever, because this was no longer about proving herself to the world. She had already done that. This was about honoring the journey, about lifting the weight of every soul who believed in her. about carrying her nation's colors with pride, and as the cool night air brushed against her face, she felt a deep calm settle in her, the calm that always came before a perfect shot, and she knew in her heart that the greatest battles were still ahead, but she was ready, she was steady, and she would not miss. The day she boarded the plane for her first international championship was a day etched into her memory. Forever, the airport itself felt like another world, filled with flashing cameras, reporters asking questions, strangers waving flags, and officials in polished uniforms guiding the team forward. Aisha walked among them in awe, her rifle case pressed tightly against her shoulder, her simple clothes making her stand out among the gleaming tracksuits of her teammates, yet she carried herself with quiet dignity, because she knew that what defined her was not appearances but the unshakable strength that had carried her from a small dusty village to this moment. She glanced at her coach who gave her a rare nod of approval, and then she thought of her father back home, standing alone at the bus stop after waving her goodbye, his heart surely swelling with both pride and longing. She carried him with her in every step, his faith the invisible shield that protected her from fear. As the plane lifted into the sky, she pressed her forehead against the window, watching the land disappear below, whispering a promise that she would return not empty-handed but with something that would make every sacrifice worthwhile. The international stage was overwhelming beyond words. The championship was held in a city bursting with lights and life. The arena was a marvel of steel and glass, filled with thousands of spectators from all over the world, their voices blending into a thunderous sea of excitement. Banners of countless nations waved in the air, and the scale of it all threatened to drown her. Yet when she stepped inside, carrying her old rifle, she reminded herself that the size of the arena did not change. The size of her focus, a target was still a target, a shot was still a shot, and silence was still her greatest weapon. Her competitors stood around her, tall and confident, dressed in flawless uniforms with the latest rifles in their hands. Some glanced at her with curiosity, others with pity, but she met their eyes without flinching, because she had faced such looks all her life, and every time she had answered them not with words but with action. She whispered silently to herself that today would be no different. Today she would let her bullets speak for her soul. The opening rounds were brutal, testing not only accuracy but endurance. The targets shifted quickly, the timers pressed hard, the crowd roared at every perfect strike, and though her heart pounded, she found herself slipping into the same rhythm that had always guided her. Inhale, exhale, fire. Her first shots landed true, her second round even tighter, and soon the scoreboard reflected her consistency, her name rising among competitors who had been champions for years. Her coach watched from the sidelines, his face stern yet glowing with quiet pride, as though he too could not believe how far she had come. She felt the weight of her father's sacrifices in every shot, the whispers of her village in the silence before each trigger pull, and when fatigue threatened her she dug into the deepest parts of herself, remembering the girl who once trained under the moonlight with nothing but a wooden stick, and she knew that if that girl could dream this far, this woman could finish the dream. As the competition advanced, pressure mounted like never before. Her arms trembled from hours of holding the rifle steady, sweat stung her eyes, and the roar of the crowd sometimes pierced her concentration. Yet she clung to her discipline like a lifeline, blocking out the noise, breathing with the same control she had always practiced. One of the senior competitors, a world champion with years of victories, faltered under the strain of a shifting wind, his shot going wide, and in that moment, Aisha realized something powerful, that even the greatest could stumble, that perfection was not about never failing but about rising when others fell. She steadied herself, adjusted for the wind, and fired dead center. The crowd gasped, her score leapt higher, and for the first time she felt the roar of strangers cheering for her, not because she was a story, not because she was a girl from a village, but because she was a competitor who had earned her place through sheer skill. That realization ignited her spirit, pushing her forward into the final round with fire blazing in her chest. The last round was the most punishing of all. Extreme distance targets, limited time, shifting conditions meant to break even the strongest focus. The stadium was silent as the competitors prepared, the weight of history pressing down on every shoulder. Aisha closed her eyes, shutting out everything, and in that silence she saw it all again, the mocking laughter of the boys who once doubted her, the hush that followed her 25 perfect shots, her father's trembling hands pressing money into hers, her coach's stern lessons, her mother's fading smile, the dusty field where it all began, and the countless nights when she whispered to herself that she would not give up. Tears filled her eyes but she steadied her breath, lifted her rifle, and began. The first shot struck true, the second closer, the third perfect, each shot carrying not only her strength but the strength of everyone who had walked with her unseen. The crowd rose to their feet, the applause thundered like a storm. But she remained calm, firing until the final bullet left her barrel and the silence returned, a silence so deep it felt like the entire world was holding its breath. When the scoreboard lit up, her name shone in silver, second place in her first international championship, a medal that many trained their entire lives to earn. The stadium erupted in celebration, cameras flashing, voices screaming her name. Her coach's face finally broke into open pride, and though she had not taken gold, she knew this silver was more than medal, it was proof, it was legacy, it was history. Her hands shook as the medal was placed around her neck, the flag of her nation rising. Behind her, tears streamed down her face as she sang the anthem, her voice trembling but strong, and in that moment she felt everything converge, the past, the present, the future. The girl with the mocked grip now standing as a woman who had silenced the world with her aim. She lifted her eyes to the crowd and for a moment imagined her father there, clapping with tears in his eyes, and though he was miles away, she knew he felt this moment in his bones. The days after the championship were a whirlwind of celebration, interviews, honors, and endless voices calling her name. She was invited to schools where children looked at her with shining eyes, little girls holding wooden sticks like rifles, dreaming of following her path. She visited her village again, greeted not by doubt but by respect. Neighbors who once mocked her now showered her with praise, and her father walked beside her, no longer carrying the quiet shame of poverty but the radiant pride of a man who had raised a champion. Yet amidst the noise and glory, Aisha remained humble, her heart grounded in the simple truth that she was still the same girl who once whispered promises into the night sky. She told herself that medals were not the end but only milestones, that her true mission was to keep walking, to keep inspiring, to keep proving that no dream was too impossible, no journey too hard, if one had the courage to grip it with both hands and never let go. And so she trained again, not satisfied with silver, her eyes set on gold, her spirit unbroken, her rifle steady, because she knew her story was not finished, it was only beginning. She vowed that the next time she stood under the world's lights, her nation's anthem would not just tremble but thunder, and she would lift her flag higher than ever before. The crowd once again silenced not by doubt but by awe, for she was the girl who had once been mocked for the way she held her rifle, and yet it was with that same grip that she had carved her name into history, forever unshaken, forever remembered, forever true. The end.